The hallway was dead silent when I found the first one. Midnight, the witching hour for the lonely, and there it was, a single slip of cream-colored paper pinned to the wood of my apartment door. My hand hovered over it, the fine tremors in my fingers betraying a mix of cold fear and a sudden, shameful curiosity. It wasn't a threat. It was a timestamp. "You leave your lights on when you can't sleep," the heavy, slanted script read. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. Someone wasn't just watching, they were memorizing my rhythms. I pulled the note free, and the scent hit me instantly, damp tobacco and the metallic tang of cold rain. It lingered in the stagnant hallway air, a ghost of a presence proving my locked door was no longer a barrier. To understand why I didn't run, you have to understand the noise. My life before her was a relentless, deafening cacophony. The city doesn't just exist, it assaults you. It's the screech of the subway brakes, the aggressive shoulder checks, the constant grinding pressure of a world that feels like it is slowly dissolving you into the gray concrete. I was a ghost in my own life, moving through the motions of survival without ever really touching the ground. Then the weight settled. It started on the morning commute, a sensation of heat between my shoulder blades that was so distinct, so heavy, it felt like a physical hand resting there. I would turn on the platform, heart hammering against my ribs, expecting to see a threat. But there was only the blur of indifferent faces, the collective exhaustion of the morning rush. Yet, the feeling persisted. It wasn't the cold, prickly sensation of being hunted. It was warmer, denser. It felt like focus. In a world that looked right through me, someone had stopped to really look. The notes became the evidence of that focus. They appeared with a terrifying, precise regularity. They weren't love letters, not yet. They were clinical observations that felt more intimate than any compliment I had ever received. "You forgot your umbrella again," I found tucked into my mailbox on a Tuesday, 5 minutes before the sky tore open. "The blue coat suits the gray mood today," slipped under my door after a particularly brutal shift where I'd felt invisible. Each note was a small paper anchor. I started carrying them in my pocket, running my thumb over the heavy indentation of the pen strokes when the anxiety of the day threatened to overwhelm me. The anonymity of the city, usually my armor, began to feel thin. I realized I was craving the exposure. There is a specific, heady rush to being the sole subject of someone's attention. It stripped away the loneliness. I wasn't just a face in the crowd anymore. I was a priority. Someone was dedicating hours of their life to the architecture of mine, learning the blueprint of my habits better than I knew them myself. I saw her for the first time on a Thursday evening. The rain was coming down in sheets, blurring the streetlights into streaks of neon and grief. I was rushing toward the station, head down against the wind, fighting the umbrella that threatened to turn inside out. Then the crowd parted. She was standing across the street, motionless in the chaos. She wore a dark trench coat that absorbed the light, the collar turned up against the storm. She wasn't hiding. She wasn't lurking in a doorway or blending into the shadows. She was leaning against the brick facade of the bank, smoking a cigarette with a slow, deliberate cadence, watching me. She stood with a terrifying, calm authority, a stillness that seemed to repel the frantic energy of the street. While everyone else rushed and scrambled, she was absolute, a silhouette that felt anchor-like. I stopped. The water soaked through my shoes, but I didn't move. I looked at her, and even across the 4 lanes of traffic, I felt the connection snap into place. The air between us thickened, charged with a sudden, static tension that drowned out the sound of the cars. She didn't wave, she didn't smile. She just took a drag of her cigarette, her eyes fixed on mine, acknowledging that I had finally seen her, seeing me. In that moment, the paranoia that should have sent me running to the police station evaporated. It was replaced by a strange, grounding comfort. The city was chaotic, loud, and dangerous, but she was watching. And as long as those dark eyes were on me, I realized with a jolt of terrifying clarity, I wasn't alone. I turned and walked into the station, feeling her gaze on my back like a shield, warmer than the coat I was wearing. The laundromat at 2 a.m. is a specific kind of fluorescent purgatory. A place where time doesn't just slow down, it curdles. It is a space of forced vulnerability, where the harsh, buzzing overhead lights strip away the protective shadows of the night, leaving you exposed and blinking against the glare. I sat on a cracked orange plastic chair, my knees pulled up to my chest, watching my clothes tumble in the industrial dryer. The machine had a rhythmic, hypnotic thrum, thump, hiss, that mirrored the frantic, circular racing of my own thoughts. The air was thick and humid, smelling of cheap lemon detergent, warm lint, and the metallic scent of heated copper wiring. It was a suffocating, artificial atmosphere, a stark contrast to the cold rain that was still lashing against the plate glass windows, turning the city outside into a blurred, weeping watercolor. I wasn't really there for the laundry. I was there because my apartment felt too quiet, and the silence there had teeth. Here, at least, there was the mechanical comfort of the spin cycle. I was staring so hard at a red shirt twisting around a pair of jeans that I didn't hear the door open. I felt it. The change in the room's pressure was instantaneous. The bell above the door gave a sharp, cheerful chime that sounded violently out of place, and a gust of raw, cold wind cut through the humid warmth of the room. I looked up, and the breath caught in my throat, a physical snag that hurt. Morgan was there. She stepped inside, and the laundromat ceased to be a public space. It became a container for her presence. She wasn't hiding in a trench coat tonight. She was wearing a structured leather jacket that gleamed wetly under the lights, the water droplets looking like dark jewels. She didn't look like someone who had a load of whites to bleach. She looked like a wolf that had wandered into a sterile laboratory. She occupied the space with a terrifying, calm authority, her boots making a heavy, deliberate sound on the linoleum floor that echoed over the hum of the machines. She didn't look at me, not directly. But I felt her awareness of me like a laser grid sweeping the room. She walked past the rows of churning washers, her movement fluid and predatory, heading toward the back wall, where a flickering vending machine hummed with a low electric whine. I should have looked away. I should have turned back to the safety of my spinning clothes. But I couldn't. I watched her profile as she stood before the machine, the harsh light catching the sharp angle of her jaw, and the damp, dark hair falling over her collar. She fished a coin from her pocket, the movement casual yet precise. The sound of the quarter dropping into the slot was deafening in the heavy quiet. Clink, whir, thud. She bent to retrieve a bottle of water, and as she straightened, she turned. She didn't walk away. She walked toward me. The aisle between the machines was narrow. To get to the exit, she had to pass within inches of my chair. As she approached, the air between us began to charge, thickening with a static tension that made the fine hairs on my arms stand up. It wasn't just the electricity of the machines. It was the voltage of proximity. She moved slowly, not rushing, letting the moment stretch until it felt like a rubber band about to snap. When she passed me, she didn't stop, but she slowed. I smelled her then, the sharp, clean scent of ozone clinging to her jacket, drowning out the cheap lemon detergent. For a second, she was so close I could have reached out and touched the cold leather of her sleeve. She didn't look down, but I saw her hand tighten around the water bottle, the skin stretching taut over her knuckles. The silence that stretched between us was heavy, intentional, and stripped of the usual social pleasantries. It was a silence that acknowledged everything, without saying a word. The door chimed again as she walked out into the storm. I sat there, the dryer buzzing to a halt, realizing with a trembling heart that I hadn't been running from her. I had been waiting. 3 days later, I sought refuge in the one place in the city that felt like it existed in a different century. The rain had returned, a relentless, gray sheet that turned the streets into slick mirrors, and I ducked into the Archivist, a used bookstore tucked into a narrow alleyway that time seemed to have forgotten. Stepping inside was like walking into the inside of a very old, very well-loved pocket. The air here was distinct, a physical weight that settled instantly in the lungs, a claustrophobic yet deeply comforting mixture of decaying paper, binding glue, and the faint, sweet scent of vanilla that rises from aging lignin. It was a silence that smelled of dust and history, a stark contrast to the wet, aggressive noise of the street I had just escaped. I moved deeper into the stacks, the uneven floorboards groaning softly under my boots. The shop was a labyrinth of towering shelves, a chaotic geography of knowledge where sunlight struggled to penetrate through the grime of the high windows. I was looking for nothing in particular, just the sensation of being hidden, of being buried under the weight of 1,000 stories that weren't mine. I found a battered copy of a philosophy text I hadn't read since college, clutching it to my chest like a shield as I made my way toward the second floor. The only way up was a spiral staircase made of wrought iron, a tight, dizzying corkscrew located in the back corner of the shop. It was architectural negligence, barely wide enough for one person, vibrating with every step you took. I started to ascend, my hand gripping the cold, rough metal of the railing, the sound of the rain now a distant, rhythmic drumming on the skylight far above. I was halfway up, suspended between the floor and the mezzanine, when the vibration on the stairs changed. It wasn't just my own weight shaking the iron anymore. There was a heavier, descending rhythm coming to meet me. I looked up, and the breath left my body in a sharp, silent rush. Morgan was coming down. She stopped 3 steps above me, and the world narrowed down to the vertical space between us. The architecture of the staircase left us no choice. There was no room to pass, no landing to step onto. We were gridlocked in the air, suspended in a cage of iron and silence. She was wearing a heavy wool coat today, charcoal gray and damp from the storm. Up close, the texture of the fabric seemed hyper-real, the tiny droplets of water caught in the fibers glistening in the dim light. The air in the stairwell, already close and stagnant, suddenly became charged, thickened by the heat radiating from her body. I was trapped, but the panic I expected didn't come. Instead, a heavy, molten heat pooled in my stomach. We stood there for a long moment, chest to chest, separated only by a foot of empty air and the book I was crushing against me. I was looking up, my neck craning slightly. She was looking down, her face framed by the shadows of the mezzanine. The perspective shifted the power dynamic instantly. She loomed above me, not threatening, but encompassing. I could smell the damp wool now, heavy and organic in the stagnant air. It was a sensory combination that was quickly becoming the only atmosphere I wanted to breathe. Her eyes dropped to the book in my arms, then tracked slowly, deliberately, back up to my face. It was a tactile gaze, a look that felt like a physical touch tracing the line of my throat. "That's a heavy choice," she said. Her voice was low, a rough, velvet sound that seemed to vibrate through the iron railing and into my hand. It was the first time she had spoken to me. The sound of it was shocking, intimate, stripping away the anonymity we had been dancing around. It wasn't a threat. It was a sultry, knowing commentary that suggested she knew exactly why I was hiding in the philosophy section. "I like the weight," I managed to whisper, the words feeling clumsy in the charged air. She didn't smile, but the corner of her mouth ticked up, a microscopic shift that felt like a victory. "Keep it," she murmured. "You'll need the ballast." Then she moved. She didn't retreat back upstairs. She continued her descent. To pass me, she had to turn sideways, pressing her back against the outer railing, while I pressed myself into the center pole. It wasn't enough room. As she squeezed past, the front of her coat brushed against my arm, a friction of damp wool on my sleeve that sent a shockwave of static electricity straight to my marrow. Her arm grazed mine, a solid, warm pressure that lasted for a heartbeat, but felt like a brand. She continued down, her boots heavy on the iron steps, leaving me standing frozen on the spiral, clutching a book I couldn't read, the skin of my arm burning where she had touched me, the air around me still swirling with her wake. The city has a way of punishing impatience with a very specific kind of geography. I took a shortcut that night, a calculated risk to shave 10 minutes off the walk home, because the cold dampness of the storm had soaked through my coat and settled into the marrow of my bones. I ducked into the alley behind the old textile district, a narrow throat of brick and darkness, where the streetlights had been shattered years ago and never replaced. It was a mistake. I knew it the moment the heavy, wet air of the alley hit me, smelling of rotting cardboard, diesel fumes, and the sharp ammonia tang of something decaying. The sensory overload I spent my life trying to outrun was waiting for me there. It wasn't just the dark, it was the noise. The alley acted as an echo chamber, amplifying the chaotic sounds of the city into a jagged, aggressive symphony. A bottle shattered somewhere up ahead, the sound crisp and violent. Shadows detached themselves from the loading docks, a group of men spilling out from a back door, their voices loud, overlapping, a wall of aggressive laughter and unpredictable movement that blocked the only exit. My chest tightened, the familiar panic rising like bile. This was the chaos I couldn't filter out. The world was closing in, loud and sharp-edged, and I was suddenly very small and very exposed. I froze, my boots slipping on the slick cobblestones, the instinct to run warring with the paralyzing fear of drawing attention. One of the shadows turned, a voice calling out something indistinct but heavy with intent. The air felt viscous, suffocating. I took a step back, bracing for the inevitable collision of my quiet world with their loud violence. Then the shadows shifted. Morgan didn't run into the alley. She materialized. She stepped out from a recessed doorway I hadn't even noticed, placing herself between me and the noise with a fluidity that was terrifying in its grace. She wasn't a stalker in that moment. She was a sudden, violent shield against the world. She stood with her back to me, facing the threat, her posture relaxed, but radiating a lethal kind of readiness. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. She simply occupied the space, her presence so absolute that it sucked the oxygen out of the alley. The group ahead faltered. The laughter died out, replaced by a confused, wary silence. They looked at her, this dark, unmoving figure in a trench coat, standing in the rain like a monolith, and they sensed the danger. She was a predator who had just claimed her territory. But it was what happened behind her back that shattered me. She stepped closer to me, pushing me gently back into the shadows of the wall, using her body to block the wind and the view of the men. She created a physical barrier, a private room carved out of the rain and the filth. And then her hand came up. She didn't touch me. That would have been too simple, too easy. Instead, she let her hand hover just behind the small of my back, inches from the fabric of my coat. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it. A radiant, intense heat that burned through the layers of wool and silk. It was a phantom touch, more intimate than if she had grabbed me. It was a gesture of protection that required a terrifying amount of restraint. She was shielding me, yes, but she was also holding herself back. I stood there, breathing in the sharp, metallic tang of her adrenaline, and realized the surveillance had shifted. This wasn't a job. It was a possessive, protective obsession. She had decided, somewhere in the quiet dark, to stand between me and the chaos. The men moved on, muttering, their aggression deflated by her stillness. We waited until their footsteps faded. When she finally turned to me, the look in her eyes was dark and unreadable. But that hand still hovered, a ghost of a caress that promised violence to anyone else and safety to me. The walk home was silent. She didn't disappear into the night this time. She walked beside me, matching her stride to mine, placing herself on the street side of the sidewalk. We didn't speak, but the distance between us had collapsed significantly. I wasn't walking alone anymore. I was walking in the gravity of her orbit. And for the first time in my life, the noise of the city couldn't touch me. My apartment is a necessity, a box to store my body between shifts, but the rooftop is my lungs. It is the only place in this suffocating city where the architecture doesn't feel like it's trying to crush me. I have spent 3 years dragging bags of potting soil up 4 flights of stairs, fighting the wind and the landlord's negligence to carve out a biosphere in the sky. It is a hidden geography of my own making, a secret world of hardy tomato plants, wild jasmine that smells like heavy sweet syrup in the heat, and ferns that drink the humidity from the air. Up here, the city is reduced to a distant oceanic hum. I went up there 2 nights after the alley, desperate for the smell of damp earth. The day had been a jagged series of minor catastrophes. A missed train, a spilled coffee, a deadline that moved up by 3 hours. And my skin felt too tight for my body. I needed the silence. I pushed open the heavy, rusted fire door, anticipating the cool rush of the wind and the solitude that usually greeted me. But the air didn't smell like jasmine. It smelled of smoke. I stopped in the doorway, my hand freezing on the metal handle. The violation was physical, a sharp twist in my gut. This was my sanctuary, the one coordinate on the map that remained unmapped by the world. And she was there. Morgan was leaning against the crumbling brick parapet, her back to me, looking out over the glittering, indifferent sprawl of the city. She had shed the heavy trench coat, wearing only a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up to her elbows, exposing forearms that looked deceptively strong in the moonlight. A cigarette burned in her hand, a tiny, angry star against the dark. She didn't turn when the door groaned shut behind me. She didn't flinch. She simply took a drag, the smoke curling up to mix with the steam venting from the building next door. "You picked the lock," I said. It wasn't a question. My voice sounded thin in the open air, stripped of the reverb of the stairwell. She exhaled, a long, slow stream of gray. "It was a suggestion, not a lock," she replied, her voice low, carried to me by the wind. She finally turned, resting her elbows on the concrete ledge, her posture relaxed, claiming the space as if she had built it herself. "The humidity up here, it's good for the ferns, bad for the structural integrity of the brick." I walked toward her. I should have been angry. I should have demanded she leave. But the anger couldn't take root. It was displaced by that same heavy magnetic pull that had drawn me to her in the laundromat. I stopped a few feet away, close enough to see the fatigue etched around her eyes, the cracks in the armor she wore so effortlessly. "Why are you here, Morgan?" I asked. "The notes, the following. Who is paying you?" She tapped the ash from her cigarette, watching it fall 4 stories into the alley below. "The contract ended 3 weeks ago," she said quietly. The admission hung in the air, heavy and strange. "A background check for the firm merger, standard corporate paranoia. They wanted to know if you were a liability. I told them you were boring, predictable." "Then why?" I stepped closer, entering her personal gravity. "If you aren't being paid, why are you on my roof?" She looked at me then, her gaze unflinching, stripping away the pretense of professional distance. The look was raw, terrified, and terrifying. "Because you aren't boring," she whispered. "You're chaotic. You move through this city like you're fighting a war no one else can see." I finished the file, I closed the case, but I couldn't look away. The silence in my own life is too loud. Watching you survive, it's the only thing that makes sense. She wasn't investigating me anymore. She was witnessing me. We stood there in the silence, the distance between us bridging. I moved to the ledge beside her, looking out at the city that had tried to drown me. It didn't look so big from up here, not with her standing between me and the drop. The Investigator had become part of the sanctuary, and for the first time, the garden didn't just feel like a hiding place. It felt like a vantage point. The nature of the paper trail changed after that night on the roof. The notes pinned to my door ceased to be cold, clinical timestamps of my movements. They evolved into something far more dangerous. They became love letters, written in the dialect of a surveillance report, a series of confessions disguised as logistical data. Coming home became a ritual of agonizing, tactile anticipation. I would walk down the hallway, heart hammering a frantic, uneven rhythm against my ribs. It wasn't fear anymore. It was a desperate, starving need to see that single slip of cream-colored paper waiting for me, pinned to the dark wood like a beacon. The rush of adrenaline when I spotted it was a physical high, a sharp spike of dopamine that made my breath hitch as I reached out to pull it free. The content had shifted from the external to the deeply personal. She wasn't just watching where I went, she was mapping the internal weather of my existence. 1845, the corner of 5th and Main, one read, the ink heavy and dark, the pen strokes aggressive. You stopped to watch the street musician. You didn't just listen. You let the sound change your posture. You softened. It changed the air in the room, just watching you let go of the day. I stood there in the dim, flickering light of the hallway, reading it over and over, tracing the loop of her Y with my thumb. It was intimate in a way that nudity never could be. She was cataloging the microclimates of my emotional state, noticing the tension in my jaw, the way I held my breath when the train was crowded, the specific half smile I saved for dogs I passed on the street. I couldn't just read them anymore. I started writing back. It began as a defensive reflex, a need to reclaim some agency in this paper relationship, but it quickly turned into a necessary confession. I bought a heavy, expensive pen, black ink, archival quality, just for this purpose. I would leave my replies taped to the outside of the door before I left for work, vibrating with the thrill of the exposure. I wasn't listening to the music, I wrote on the back of a grocery receipt, pressing hard enough to indent the paper. I was waiting for the feeling of being watched to come back. I only soften when I feel the weight of your attention. It's the only time I feel real. This paper dialogue built a tension that was thicker, heavier, and more honest than anything we could have managed face-to-face. In the spoken world, we were still careful, guarding our words. But on paper, stripped of the immediate danger of eye contact, we were reckless. We traded secrets like currency. She told me about the insomnia that drove her to the streets. I told her about the noise in my head that only her presence could silence. The door became a membrane, a thin barrier through which we passed the rawest parts of ourselves. Then came the note that shattered the last of my resolve. It was a Tuesday, raining again. The note was waiting, damp from the humidity. 12 o'clock, the crosswalk, it said. The handwriting was jagged, hurried. I was behind you, close enough to smell the shampoo you use. The wind blew your hair back, and it brushed my face. I had to put my hands in my pockets to keep from grabbing you. I wanted to anchor you against the traffic. I wanted to know if the heat coming off you felt the same as it looks. I read it, and the air in the hallway seemed to vanish. The physical ache in her words transferred directly into my body. It wasn't just observation anymore. It was a tactile craving. The paper wasn't enough. The ink was too dry to carry the weight of this want. I unlocked my door, my hands shaking. I didn't want to read about her hands in her pockets. I needed to feel them. The distance we had maintained had become unbearable. I went inside, but I left the deadbolt turned, a silent invitation. The notes had built a bridge, but now I needed her to cross it. The bravery of midnight often dissolves in the harsh light of morning. I spent the day trying to scramble the signal, taking a different train, buying groceries I didn't need, trying to blur the map she had drawn. I was trying to become static again. But you cannot ghost a woman whose profession is finding things that do not want to be found. I got back to my building at 9 p.m., exhausted by the effort of hiding in plain sight. I walked up the 4 flights of stairs, counting the steps to ground myself. I turned the corner of the hallway, expecting the empty wood of my door, or maybe, hope is a traitorous thing, another note. There was no paper tonight. There was only Morgan. She was leaning against my doorframe, arms crossed over her chest, occupying the space where the notes usually lived. She wasn't hiding in the shadows. She was standing directly under the flickering hallway light, illuminated and undeniable. She wore the same leather jacket, but she looked tired, the lines around her eyes etched deeper. She didn't push off the wall when she saw me. She just watched me walk the length of the hall, her gaze a physical weight that pinned me to the floorboards. "You took the L train," she said. Her voice was flat, devoid of accusation, but heavy with fact. "And you bought lemons at the bodega on 4th. You hate lemons." I stopped 5 feet from her. The air in the hallway instantly pressurized. "I'm changing the routine," I said, my voice sounding brittle. "I'm introducing variables." "You're running," she corrected. She took a step toward me, closing the distance. The scent of her, rain, tobacco, and now a sharp, nervous heat, filled the narrow space. "You opened the door last night, and today you're trying to board up the windows. Why?" "Because it's too much," I confessed, the words tearing out of me. "The notes, the watching, knowing that you know. I can't breathe when I know you're looking at me like that." "Like what?" she challenged, stepping closer. Her eyes were dark, unflinching. They didn't let me look away. They demanded I stay in the room with her. "Like I'm the only thing in the world," I whispered. Morgan stopped. She looked at me, really looked at me, and her expression fractured. The cool professional mask slipped, revealing a desperation that mirrored my own. She reached out, her hand hovering near my arm, trembling slightly. "You are," she said, her voice rough. Don't you get it? Out there, she gestured vaguely to the stairwell, to the city screaming outside. It's all noise. It's static. It's people lying and hiding and making mess. My head is a constant screaming loop of other people's disasters. But when I watch you, when I see you reading on the roof or buying coffee or just standing in the rain, the noise stops. You are the only quiet thing I have ever found. You aren't just a subject. You're the anchor. The admission hung between us, heavy and absolute. She wasn't hunting me. She was anchoring herself to me. My fear dissolved, replaced by a clarity that shook me to my core. I wasn't running from a stalker. I was running from the terrifying reality that I was needed. I looked at the keys in my hand. Then I looked at the door behind her, the barrier I had kept locked against the world. I'm not running anymore, I said softly. I stepped past her, the heat of her body grazing my arm, and slid the key into the lock. The tumblers clicked, a loud, mechanical sound of surrender. I pushed the door open, revealing the dark sanctuary of my apartment. I didn't step inside alone. I turned back to her, standing in the harsh hallway light, and held the door open. Come in, I said, meeting her gaze. It's quiet in here. The door clicked shut, a heavy, mechanical period at the end of a sentence we had been writing for months. The lock engaged, sealing out the damp hallway and the prying eyes of the city. My apartment, usually a cavern of solitary silence, suddenly felt small, pressurized by her presence. The air shifted instantly, becoming dense, heavy with the scent of wet leather and the ozone clinging to her coat. Outside, the storm finally broke. Thunder cracked directly overhead, shaking the window panes in their frames. The lights flickered once, twice, and died, plunging us into a gray, aqueous twilight, illuminated only by the flashes of lightning tearing through the sky. The darkness didn't hide us. It stripped us. In the gloom, the visual distractions faded, leaving only the heat signature of her standing just inside the entryway. We stood in the dark, the only sound the aggressive drumming of rain against glass and the ragged rhythm of our breathing. The physical distance we had maintained with such agonizing precision began to evaporate. I could feel the warmth radiating from her, a tangible wave bridging the gap before we even touched. Morgan didn't move. She stood rigid with a terrifying amount of restraint, a woman who made her living by observing, not touching. I watched her in the lightning flashes, the sharp line of her jaw, the wet strands of hair plastered to her neck. I don't know how to do this part, she whispered, her voice rough, stripped of its professional armor. I know how to watch you. I know how to protect you. But this, the proximity, you aren't watching anymore, I said, my voice low, anchored by her gravity. You're here. I reached out. Her skin was cold from the storm, damp with rain, but underneath was a searing heat. Her fingers were rough, calloused from years of climbing fire escapes, but her touch was shocking in its gentleness. She flinched slightly, then her hand tightened around mine, a desperate, grounding grip. She pulled me in, erasing the last inch of space. My chest collided with the wet leather of her jacket. She buried her face in the crook of my neck, breathing me in. I felt her exhale, a long, shaky release of tension she must have carried for weeks. You're real, she murmured against my skin. You're not just a coordinate. I'm real, I whispered, gripping the damp wool of her collar. She lifted her head. In the gray light, her eyes were wide and searching. The unflinching gaze she used to dissect my routine was now turned on my mouth, hungry and terrified. She brought her hands up to frame my face. Her thumbs traced my cheekbones with a slow reverence, memorizing me with touch instead of ink. Her hands were strong, steadying, holding me in place as the world dissolved. I need to know, she said, barely audible over the thunder, if the quiet is real. She didn't wait. She leaned down, and her mouth found mine. The kiss wasn't tentative. It claimed. It was a collision of texture and heat, a desperate thing tasting of the storm and the salt of adrenaline. It wasn't polished. It was messy and urgent. I felt the precise texture of her intention in the way her lips moved against mine, a demand to be let in. The tension in my chest snapped. I melted into the solid structure of her body. Her hands slid into my hair, anchoring me. The sensation was overwhelming, The scratch of leather, the softness of her mouth, the hard pressure of her hips. It was sensory overload, but unlike the city's noise, this filled me. The static in my head stopped. There was only the heavy rhythm of our hearts and the silence of being found. The storm raged, shaking the foundation, but it was irrelevant. We were the eye of the hurricane, suspended in a calm that smelled of surrender. I realized I hadn't just opened my door to an investigator. I had opened it to the only person who knew how to build a shelter out of the wreckage of my routine. Her kiss deepened, slow and deliberate, and I knew I would never lock the door against her again. The world could scream outside. In the circle of her arms, it was finally, perfectly, quiet. The morning sun didn't bring the harsh glare of exposure I had feared. Instead, it brought a soft, integrated light that reshaped the geometry of my entire life. The dynamic shifted overnight, from the vertical alignment of the hunter and the hunted to the horizontal stability of partners walking abreast. Morgan doesn't follow me anymore. She walks beside me, always positioning herself on the street side of the sidewalk, placing her body between me and the chaotic current of the traffic. It is a subtle, protective architecture. She scans the crowd with a predator's efficiency, filtering out the threats so I don't have to. She carries the vigilance, so I can finally carry the calm. She has become a mobile sanctuary, allowing me to move through the streets without feeling like I am being eroded by them. The rooftop garden has ceased to be my secret escape. It is now our shared kingdom. We ascend the rusted stairs in the evenings, not as intruders breaking a lock, but as sovereigns reclaiming our territory. The space has changed with her presence. It isn't just a place to hide, it is a place to exist. I spend the twilight hours kneeling in the dirt, pruning the jasmine that has finally started to bloom, the scent heavy and sweet in the cooling air. Morgan sits on the ledge, her back against the brick, reading the philosophy books I used to clutch like shields in the bookstore. There is an intimacy to these quiet moments that feels heavier and more significant than the storm. I can hear the turn of the page, the scratch of her lighter, the deep, rhythmic intake of her breath as she smokes. We don't need to speak. The silence between us is no longer a void to be filled. It is a structure we inhabit together. Occasionally, she will look up from the text, her dark eyes tracking my movements among the ferns with that familiar, intense precision. But now, the gaze doesn't strip me bare. It clothes me. It wraps around me like a weighted blanket, grounding me in the present moment. I am no longer a target to be analyzed. I am a detail to be memorized. The notes haven't stopped. If anything, they have proliferated, migrating from the public surface of my apartment door to the intimate geography of my private life. The medium has shifted, but the intensity remains. I no longer find them pinned to wood. I find them scrawled in the steam on the bathroom mirror after I shower. The heat suits you. I find them tucked into the coffee filter in the morning. Drink this before you face the noise. I found one tucked into the soil of the potted fern, the paper damp, but the ink indelible. You nurture things until they survive. Do that for yourself. I find them slipping out from under my pillow when I wake. You stopped fighting in your sleep at 3:14 a.m. These paper ghosts are no longer surveillance logs. They are evidence of a proximity so close it blurs the edges of identity. There is a terrifying beauty in being known this well. I realized that for years I equated being watched with being threatened. I thought the only way to be safe was to be invisible, to be a ghost in the machine of the city. I was wrong. Being studied, when done with this level of reverence, is the ultimate form of care. It turns out I didn't need to hide from the world to find peace. I didn't need to build higher walls or deeper bunkers. I just needed someone strong enough to stand between me and the chaos. Someone who could look at the mess of my life and see a pattern worth protecting. We stand at the parapet now as the city lights flicker on, a sprawling ocean of electricity and noise below us. The sirens wail, the traffic grinds, the millions of lonely people rush toward destinations that won't satisfy them. But up here, in the gravity of her presence, the noise cannot touch us. She rests her hand on the small of my back, that familiar, searing heat anchoring me to the earth. I lean into her, feeling the solid, unshakable reality of her frame. We are looking out at the world, but we are no longer part of its frantic equation. We are safe in the silence we built together. I found the final note this morning, resting on the pillow where her head had been just moments before. It was just 5 words, written in that heavy, slanted script that used to terrify me, but now looks like a promise. I am not going anywhere. If you have ever wanted to be the sole focus of someone's world, to find the quiet in the center of the noise, subscribe for more stories. The door clicked shut, sealing the world out.